Edo period or Tokugawa period is a period in the history of Japan that lasted from 1603 to 1868. It's called so because the capital of the city during this time was moved to the Edo city. Now it's called Tokyo. It was moved from Kyoto city. The second name of this period, Tokugawa period, it got because the shoguns from the Tokugawa family were ruling the country. Shogun in ancient Japan was a person who was fighting against the wild tribes on the north. Later, he became a military leader who was chosen by the emperor, and during Tokugawa period, he became the ruler of the country, leader of the country, while emperor started taking just a nominal role in ruling of the country. This period is being characterized by relative stability, closed economy, and the concentration on the self-sufficiency inside the country, concentration on production. These are also the basic ideas of the ideology called autarky, and this is my chosen ideology. This ideology is used as a characteristic for societies. Those are concentrated on the self-sufficiency, self-reliance, on the closed economy, and on independency on other societies. It's also been used for the countries. It's also important to say that this period lead to the next period, which is called Meiji Restoration, and this period is famous for creating the capitalism in the Japan. It's also important to say that this period is called the last traditional period in the history of Japan, which means that this was the last period when there was kind of feudal system in the country. In order to understand why there was a need in this particular system during Tokugawa period, I will need to talk a bit about the period that was before Tokugawa period, which is 14th century. In context of this time period, I will be talking about two rulers of the country who impacted it the most. First one is Oda Nobunaga, who is known as Great Unifier of Japan. The second one is his vassal, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, who won in the fight for power after Oda's death. Before Oda Nobunaga came to the power, the country was fragmented. The agriculture and production was in state of decline. People recognized themselves as parts of the separated principalities, not as the parts of the whole country. Oda Nobunaga joined half of the Japanese provinces under his rule, mostly by capturing them. Oda Nobunaga was trying to create a planned economy in the country, but because of his military policy, there were a lot of hostile daimyos who forced him to commit traditional suicide, seppuku, in 1583. After his death, the fight for the power began, and the country was left without a ruler for 3 years. It changed in 1585 when Oda Nobunaga's talented vassal, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, could convince some of the powerful daimyos to make an alliance with him and brutally dealt with all of his enemies. Toyotomi Hideyoshi continued Oda Nobunaga's policy, but he also had the ambitious military plans. He invaded Korea and destroyed the relationships with China. He also was planning the invasion of the Philippines. The result of ruling of these two people, that Japan became partly territorially unified, but the country still was fragmented, while the government had some impact over the entire country. Because of the strife during many years, the agriculture and the production was in state of decline. Many peasants were recruited to the army, and also peasants had to pay too big taxes during the wars. Also, a lot of food was taken from the peasants to the army, and so some of the fields and some of the factories were burned. It's also important to say about the relationships between these two rulers and were foreigners, because the isolation of the country will be a characteristic of the coming Tokugawa period. So, in this context, I would want to talk about the Francisque Xavier. It was a Jesuit missionary who arrived on the first Portuguese ship, and he had to leave the country, but before doing that, he could convert one samurai to the Christianity. And after that, he got an idea of the coming to Japan with the mission of converting its population to the Christianity. So he came back, and he lived in one province. He was selling the European and Chinese products to the daimyo who was ruling this province, while this daimyo was giving him a right to convert his people to the Christianity. Sometime later, this daimyo wanted to get a permission from Xavier that all of the products coming from the Europe will go through his province. Unfortunately, Francis Xavier couldn't promise him that. That's why the daimyo declared the Christianity illegal religion, and the Xavier had to leave. But by the time he left, he could convert to the Christianity 150 people. He moved to another province and lived there for 30 years until he died. When he died, he and his group converted to Christianity 150,000 people. Participating in the military campaign later, Toyotomi Hideyoshi met the group of the Christians and published two orders. One of them was restricting rich daimyos with a high income authorized to convert to the Christianity. The second order ordered all of the missionaries to leave the country in 20 days time period, otherwise they would be executed. But Toyotomi Hideyoshi didn't have enough ships to bring the missionaries out of the country. That's why caught missionaries were brought to one city and left there without the security. That's why all of the Jesuits came back to their flock soon. Europeans arrived to Japan in the first half of the 16th century, and they also played the main role in closing of the country during the Tokugawa period. That's why it's important to tell about them. Portuguese and Spanish ships find Japan by accident in 1537. Dutch and English sailors arrived in 1600s. Once the Europeans arrived in Japan, they were trying to spread the Christianity, and the missionaries who were on the ships and who arrived with the sailors helped with it. First, Christians were converted into Christianity powerful daimyos who lived near the coast. They ordered all of their peasants to also become the Christians, asking in return for more beneficial trading conditions. Oda Nobunaga made an alliance with the Christians in order to fight against the Buddhist influence in the country. Toyotomi Hideyoshi was trying to expel them, but he didn't have enough time for that. In the beginning of the Tokugawa period, Tokugawa Ieyasu, first ruler of the country during Tokugawa period, had good relationships with the Europeans. There also was an interesting story about him and English sailor William Adams. William Adams arrived to the Japan on the first English boat in Japan that also founded by accident. He got through reception with the emperor, where he impressed him so much that Shogun Tokugawa Ieyasu decided to make him his own personal advisor. William Adams lived in Japan for more than 30 years, and he married a Japanese woman who gave birth to 2 kids. He also was one of the most trusted people at the government. William Adams played the main role in building of the relationship between England and Japan. Once Netherlands and England knew that William Adams is personal advisor of Tokugawa Ieyasu, they sent a lot of ships to the Japan. And because of William Adams' activity, the Japan's government allowed England and Netherlands to build the manufacturers on the Hirado Island. The Netherlands got this permission first, and when the England arrived, William Adams was advising them to build the manufacturer on another island, because on the Hirado they will have a strong competitor in face of the Netherlands. But unfortunately, William Adams had bad relationships with captain of the England ship. That's why England also built the manufacturer on the Hirado, and soon they had to leave the Japan because this trading wasn't bringing them enough money. While Netherlands and England were mostly trading with Japan, Portuguese and Spain were acting more aggressively in spreading the Christianity. And for example, leader of the main port of Japan, Nagasaki City, converted to the Christianity and ordered all of the citizens to also convert to the Christianity. This aggressive policy played an important role when Portugal and Spain were restricted from entering the country, while Netherlands got permission to stay there. Tokugawa Ieyasu was the first shogun, the first leader of the country during Tokugawa period. He also built the system that characterizes the Tokugawa period. Tokugawa Ieyasu was from the family of owner of the province. He was educated as the warrior, but from the childhood he showed the talents in diplomatic art. When Tokugawa Ieyasu became the owner of his father's province, he started building the relationships with powerful daimyos. When he became owner of the province, he published 7 orders. Those created the system. The new version of that will exist during Tokugawa period. First and sixth laws from 7 published were controlling the taxes system. They increased the taxes while doing them more stable for the peasants. Other laws were controlling the recruitment system. Every powerful daimyo had to provide one person for an army. He also had to provide the money for feeding this person with the rice. After the death of Toyotomi Hideyoshi, the country was left without the ruler. The main competitor of Tokugawa Ieyasu in fight for power was Ishida Mitsunari, and they met in the Battle of Sekigahara. Before it, the Tokugawa Ieyasu sent 180 letters to 108 daimyos. 99 of them agreed to help and agreed to support Tokugawa Ieyasu in the battle. Tokugawa also had a lot of the weapons that he bought from the Netherlands. And Tokugawa Ieyasu also knew a lot about his enemy, while Ishida Mitsunari didn't have an understanding of what the power of Tokugawa is. The fact that Tokugawa Ieyasu used Dutch weapons proves that he wasn't ideologically against the Christianity, and the fact that he was doing the isolation policy was caused by the other reasons. Oda Nobunaga and Toyotomi Hideyoshi didn't have the origin from the emperor's family. That's why, according to the Japanese law, their rule and their reign wasn't legit, while the Tokugawa Ieyasu declared him as the distant relative of the emperor's family, which made his ruling legitimate. In fact, there are no proofs that what he said is true. After the Battle of Sekigahara, of all owners of the land in Japan, daimyos, were divided into 3 groups: Han, Fudai daimyos, and Tozama daimyos. Han daimyos were those who were directly in the land that was owned by shogunate. The Fudai daimyos were those who supported Tokugawa Ieyasu in the Battle of Sekigahara. Tozama daimyos were those who didn't support Tokugawa Ieyasu. Comparing to Fudai daimyos, Tozama daimyos had much worse positions in the society, and government often was using the wealth of the Tozama daimyos to increase the government's budget. Once Tokugawa Ieyasu got the title of shogun, he was trying to reduce power of the emperor. In order to do that, he moved the capital of the country from Kyoto, where it was before and where emperor lived, to the Edo City. Based on the laws of Japan, both of them, shogun and emperor, were the rulers of the country. But the difference in their factual influence in the country was really big. The situation was also noted by foreigners who came to Japan at that time. They called the emperor Mikado and the shogun Kotai. Both words means in Japanese emperor, but Mikado is more ancient title, which emphasized the difference in their role in the life of Japan. Mikado was the head of religious ceremonies, had the function of the supreme priest and didn't defile himself with earthly affairs, and the shogun personified a supreme power in the country. Once Ieyasu came to the power and became the only ruler of the country, he concentrated on improving and developing the agriculture and production in the country. Agriculture in Japan at the beginning of the 17th century was in state of decline. It was unproductive and its general condition was affected by a long period of internecine wars, frequent distraction of peasants to perform various duties, military taxes, collection of additional food to supply the army. Therefore, there were rather low taxes were established, which was a necessary measure. This gave reason to contemporaries to believe that under Ieyasu there was humane government, which in Japanese sounds like jinsei. The proof that Tokugawa concentrated on the agriculture can be also provided by the fact that the wealth of the daimyos was measured in the number of the rice that was produced on their territories. After structurizing the agriculture, Tokugawa Ieyasu published another important law. He set strict inheritance rules. Oldest son always got everything. It had both good and bad aftermaths. It removed possibility of fighting for the power, but caused appearing of some weak shoguns. For example, ninth shogun had defects of speech and nobody could understand him. It also caused appearing of many shoguns who didn't rule the country, but it let the shogunate exist for more than 2 centuries. Tokugawa Ieyasu was a talented ruler who could see the needs of the country in the future, who could analyze the situation in the country, and the base of the system that he created let shogunate exist for more than 2 centuries. In the result of the activity of Tokugawa Ieyasu and his son, the new system formed in the country, and it was much different from the system that was before. And first and very important characteristic of this system is social immobility. This social immobility was expressed in dividing all population of the country into 4 classes: samurais, peasants, artisans, and merchants. These classes were put in the order from the highest one to the lowest one. In fact, it was social hierarchy. It was based on Neo-Confucianism. Samurais were the highest class because they were warriors. Peasants and artisans were next because they were creating the products, while merchants were just selling these products, not creating anything. That's why they were the lowest class. Government pledged to give the rights to samurais every 3 months. They did it because the only thing samurais could do was fight, and since there were no wars or conflicts in the country, their service wasn't needed, and they couldn't feed themselves. Tokugawa Ieyasu was strictly tracking social immobility, and after the end of the war, he ordered all people except samurais to pass all of the weapons they have: swords, bows, and arrows, because historically samurais were the only class who were allowed to carry the weapons. New system was called Bakuhan. Bakuhan included governmental system and the social system. Bakufu means the government, it was the name of the government, while Han in Japanese meant something like feudal position. This governmental system was highly structurized, especially comparing to the previous systems. The shogun had a lot of personal advisors. They were called rojus. The government was divided into 2 parts. One was dealing with citizens and with affairs inside the country. The second group was dealing with the foreigner. There also was a strict order of authority in the lands, and even on those lands that shogunate didn't own, the structure was really strict, and the daimyos on their lands had to create exactly this system for ruling the lands. In the new system, shogun and the government concentrated on improving the agriculture and production in the country. Tokugawa Ieyasu was trying to also build the production where it already existed. For example, he captured the mines of the north daimyos and he found 2 mines. The new system also included structured system of paying the taxes, especially of paying them by peasants. Even though the limitation of the trading with the foreigners limited entrepreneurs' activity, it let the daimyos concentrate on the agriculture and trading inside the country. All of the reforms led to the sudden expansion of economy in the end of 17th century. Conflict of Japanese government and the Europeans began when Toyotomi Hideyoshi was ruling the country. It started because Jesuits sent from the Roman Empire were propagandizing Christianity really aggressive. There also was a case when captain of the Spanish ship got to the affirmative with the Toyotomi Hideyoshi. Captain was showing to Emperor the map of the lands of the Philip II. Toyotomi Hideyoshi was curious about how Philip II could capture so many lands. Captain responded that Philip II sends the missionaries first to propagandize the Christianity, and then he sends the troops. After that, Toyotomi Hideyoshi published 2 orders, but they didn't work because all of the Jesuits were brought to one city and left without security, and they came back to their flocks soon. After that, the situation was only getting worse, and a lot of laws were passed from 1612. They were limiting trading with the foreigners. For example, in this time period, the Spanish ships were banned from entering the country. The final solution was taken after Shimabara and uprising. It was the uprising on the Shimabara Peninsula, and it was the uprising of the peasants. The protest started because of the taxes policy, but they quickly developed into a religious protest. The shogun couldn't win the people until he sent 30,000 of warriors there. The majority of people who uprised were killed. Some of them were crucified near the road. When people who uprised saw 30,000 of the troops, they tried to hide in the castle, and their shogun couldn't win them. That's why he asked Dutch ships for support. They were firing at the castle for 6 days. Then they left and gave all of the cannons to the shogun. The support that Netherlands provided in the Shimabara uprising played an important role when shogunate was taking a decision about allowing different European countries to trade with Japan. And in the next 22 centuries, Netherlands were the only country that was allowed to trade with Japan. Also, there was an agreement about the protection that was signed with Netherlands and England. This agreement was ordering all of the Netherlands and English ships, if they see Spanish or Portuguese ships, to catch them, and all the Jesuits bring to the capital of the country. The majority of the missionaries were executed later. To that moment, England already left the country because they couldn't stably provide the products for Japan, and they also faced a strong competitor in face of Netherlands. That's why to this time, Netherlands were the only country that was trading with Japan. They were trading on the Hirata city where they had a factory, and Tokugawa Ieyasu allowed them to have it there. But when his son of Tokugawa Ieyasu, came to the power, he decided that there is too much trading happening between Netherlands and Japan. That's why he ordered to destroy manufacture on the Hirata, and all of the Dutch people were moved to Dejima city. Its picture you can see on the slide. Once Dutch people moved to Dejima island, the conditions of the trading changed, and Dutch ship was allowed to enter the Nagasaki port only once a year. In different times, there were from 15 to 20 people living on the Dejima island, and for them 150 translators were provided. It was done by Japanese government to prevent wish of the Dutch people to learn Japanese language. The only people from Japanese population who were allowed to enter this island were servants, translators, and prostitutes, because Dutch people weren't allowed to come to Japan with wives or children. Dutch were allowed to stay in the country only because they promised not to try to propagandize Christianity in any form. From this moment, all of the Europeans' books, even not religious, were restricted in the Japan. After almost all of the Christians were expelled from the country, followers of Christianity from the population of Japan were persecuted. After they were caught, often they were tortured and killed. During Tokugawa period, the situation in the country was the most stable when three first shoguns were ruling the country. They are Tokugawa Ieyasu, his son Tokugawa Hidetada, and his grandson Tokugawa Ieyasu. When Tokugawa Ieyasu left his post of the shogun in 1605, and his son Hidetada took it, in fact, Tokugawa Ieyasu was ruling the country until his death in 1616. Tokugawa Ieyasu was engaged in relationships with the foreigners, while his son was working with the affairs inside the country. It was an efficient system of the government. Hidetada also promoted his own initiatives, and he published a princely code. Code published by him was stricter in control above the daimyos. Now they had to tell to the bakufu about everything they do on their territories, including repair of the houses or change in the daily schedule. It also included advices to the daimyos about how to rule their lands. They were prescribing daimyos to choose talented rulers of their lands. During the time of ruling of Hidetada and Ieyasu, his son, also were published a lot of laws limiting the trading with the foreigners. For example, they were limiting even the trading with friendly countries such as Netherlands, and during the time of their rule in the country, the trading with Netherlands was limited by two places, Nagasaki and Hirata, where Netherlands had a manufacture. Second and third shogun were also trying to structurize and centralize the military. That's why they changed the rules of recruiting of soldiers from the daimyo's lands. Now every daimyo had to provide the soldiers to the central army shogunate. It was the same measure that Tokugawa Ieyasu was doing in his province when he was preparing for the battle in Sekigahara. Talking specifically about Tokugawa Ieyasu, under his reign, hostage system takes its final shape. To control the daimyos, there was a hostage system. It's called Sankin Kontari. In the beginning, only Tozama daimyos had to do that, but under his reign, every daimyo had to live in capital with his family at least for 1 year before he got a right to rule his lands. For that purposes, every daimyo had to build his own house not far from the capital of the country. After daimyo land, he had to leave one of his relatives in the capital. He also published the nobility code that was regulating rules of behavior and order of the inheritance, not only in the shogunate, but in the entire country. He also found a measure to control the hostile daimyos. It was a moving policy, so he was moving the daimyos to control them. He was moving the daimyos from their lands to other. Their previous ownership were given to Bakufu or to the Fudai daimyos, friendly daimyos. Iemitsu also restricted Spanish and Portuguese ships to enter the country. He also restricted the European books, especially the religious books, to be imported in the country. Under the reign of Iemitsu, Bakufu reaches its peak of the power and also the peak of the centralization. Fourth and fifth shoguns were son of Tokugawa Iemitsu and his younger brother. It's also important to say that Tokugawa Iemitsu died unexpectedly, and samurais, who at this moment were without the work for 50 years, decided to organize an uprising, kill the fourth shogun, bring the Tozama daimyos, hostile daimyos, to the power. They hoped that Tozama daimyos start fighting for the power, where they samurais will have a place to serve. The government, Bakufu, could uncover this plan, but the situation was really dangerous. The fourth shogun was put on the throne as a child, and he also was really sick. That's why, in fact, he didn't rule the country, and he fully trusted to his advisors. There was nothing special during the time when he was ruling the country. The fifth shogun was the younger brother of the fourth shogun, and he came to the power when the fourth shogun died. His name was Tokugawa Tsunayoshi. For his character and a lot of unpopular measures, people didn't like him. He spent too much money on the really expensive festivals. That's why the government, Bakufu, started feeling some problems with the budget. He was called Dog Shogun because he introduced execution for cruelties with the animals. Often unguilty people were tortured and killed. When he was ruling the country, there also were a lot of natural disasters. Bakufu had to spend a lot of money on eliminating the damage after the natural disasters. In the result of these disasters and expensive festivals, the Bakufu had serious problems with the money. So Shogun decided to reduce the quality of the country. So the Shogun decided to reduce the quality of the coins, and he decided to add less gold there. But this measure greatly increased the number of the coins in the country and caused the inflation. It's also important to say that under the reign of the fifth shogun, there was a big change in the culture. He called himself patron of the art, and partly that was true. Under the reign of fifth shogun, there was a big change in culture. It was expressed in fast development of big cities and appearing of the entertainment districts. The concept was opposite to the principle of social immobility, because everybody could do everything what samurais, the highest class, did, if he had enough money. This shogun also was destroying the estate system because he was employing the previous merchants, the lowest class, as his personal advisors. Since the moment when problems of Bakufu appeared first, more than 50 years passed, and the situation didn't really change. But the problems were becoming more and more visible in the country, which caused the Kyoto reforms in 1716. The person who was doing these reforms was Tokugawa Yoshimune. When he was 12 years old, he was put in Principality Key and he was ruling it. Unexpectedly, he helped to improve the economic situation in this principality by reforming the agriculture. He was improving the irrigation systems. He forced the people to create the warehouses with the rices for the case of the natural disasters. He also tried to keep the price of the rice on the same level. The thing that this shogun did much differently from other shoguns was that he wanted to know more about what's happening in the country. So in his principality, he created a group of 20 samurais who were supposed to create a report about what's happening in the country every month. These samurais moved with him to the Edo when he became shogun. He also was put in the box outside of the shogunate building once a month. The people were supposed to put the pieces of paper with their problems written down. Yoshimune structurized the administration system. He created a department that was working on exclusively financial problems. There were two main people. One of that was working with the civil side of the problem, while the second one concentrated on the more global measures. He reduced the corruption. He also reduced the luxury in the emperor's house, and he wanted to reduce it in the houses of the samurais. It was supposed to prevent aristocracy from spending too much money on entertainment. He also limited the gambling. He was called the rice shogun because he concentrated on the rice a lot. He improved the irrigation systems in the entire country. He made the daimyos create the warehouses of the rice both on their territories and on shogun's lands. He created a central exchange that was controlling the prices of the rice with the help of kabunakama, groups of merchants who had a right for monopoly for giving part of their income to the government. He understood the economic processes. And when there was a big harvest of rice, he didn't let the merchants reduce the prices for this rice in order not to let them grow later. His ideal was the first shogun, Tokugawa Ieyasu, and same as him, Yoshimune tried to control the daimyos. He timely increased the taxes for the daimyos, but he made them stay in the capital in the hostage system only for half of the year instead of 1 year, which was before. He factually reduced the spendings of the daimyos. Yoshimune also saw the possibilities in development of the new lands, and for those who was doing that, the taxes were decreased. He encouraged the activity of the merchants, and under Yoshimune's reign, it was much easier to get a spot for trading in the city. In the Tokugawa period, Yoshimune is called second, the greatest ruler of the country after Tokugawa Ieyasu. In the second half of the 18th century, the trading relationships were actively developing, especially inside the villages, which led to the inequality inside the country, and especially inside the villages where local markets were highly monopolized. And policy of development of production that the country was doing was only worsening the situation, because in the villages were appearing the rich owners of the manufacturers who were setting too high prices. Merchants were joining in the guilds, organizing them according to the kabunakama structure. Because of the feudal structure, the labor market wasn't really big, and the villagers had to go to the city in order to find a food or a job. That's why in this time there started appearing the empty villages. There were a lot of natural disasters, and agriculture couldn't provide enough food, and the protest moves grew. The agriculture was worsening because a lot of peasants escaped to the city. There also were a lot of peasants' revolts. For example, in 1786, there were 57 of them. In 1788, 117. There were big rebellions in Edo and Osaka. The government was trying to control the kabunakama, which eventually led to the increase of the corruption because it was hard to get the agreement for trading. Kansei reforms appeared in the time when the crisis of Bakufu took its final shape and the problems were clear. After the Kyoto reforms, government Bakufu started recognizing the kabunakama and monopolization in the country as a problem. They were trying to increase the control above the kabunakama, which led to the growth of the corruption between the officers who were given the permissions for the trading. Shogun was also trying to increase his control in the country. That's why he was marrying his relatives to different powerful daimyos, which also led to the growth of the corruption. There also were a lot of natural disasters after the reforms, which led to the smaller taxes income. Council reforms were trying to solve all of these problems, and they were based on the Kyoto reform. Samurais also weren't in the best situation. The government couldn't provide enough rice for them. That's why the government forced some of the usurers to excuse all of the debts of the samurais. Many peasants lost their lands because of the debts, and they became the part of the labor market that kept growing. Bakufu also decreased the budget that was provided for the daimyos to improve their lands, and which led to the discontent. Government ordered to return all of the escaped peasants to their villages. It was a measure to improve the agriculture. Since this period of time, the role of the shogun becomes only nominal, and in fact, the advisor of the shogun, Matsudaira Sarunobu, was doing these reforms. His picture you can see on the slide. In the result, the council reforms partly solved the problems, but it caused a big discontent in the population of both peasants and the rich daimyos. These reforms, even though they were solving their problems, only delayed the problems of the Bakufu. They appeared under the reign of the next shoguns. Economic problems and the growing tension caused the discontent not only of the powerful daimyos, but also the discontent of the normal people. In 1837, there was a small uprising in southern Japan, but it affected the shogunate because the leader of this uprising was a worker from the Bakufu administration. It affected the people's mind and made them understand that now the power of the government is not absolute. During this period, the Japanese government is concentrated on the problems inside the country and can't control the relationships with foreigners. Some of them got in Japan and were teaching them European science, especially medicine. Russian ship was allowed to Nagasaki port. In this period, the country was preparing and was creating the preconditions for fast development of the capitalism during the next period, major restoration. During this period, the level of isolation starts decreasing. There were temple reforms during the 1841 year. They were copying the Kyoto and Kansei reforms, but they were different from them because they made the situation only worse. In these reforms, the government recognized the kabunakama and monopolization as the problem. That's why the advisor of the shogun tried to cancel the kabunakama organizations, but prices only got bigger. The kabunakama already were too powerful. They also were trying to support the system of the social immobility. They were trying to increase the level of the influence of the samurais in the society. This period of time is being characterized by different situations in different provinces. Somewhere where there were the talented rulers, who mostly were from the poor samurai class, the situation was really good, but somewhere it was really bad and the peasants were escaping from the villages to the cities. The provinces where the situation was good were mostly independent on the central government. There are different opinions about when did Tokugawa period end. One historian says that it ended when the last shogun refused from the throne. Another historians say that it ended when the Japan opened its borders for the trading with the other countries. Since the beginning of the 19th century, USA government was thinking about opening the doors of Japan. It has a good position for locating a military base or a base with reserves for American ships. Russia also had a high interest in opening the Japan. It sent an expedition to Japan, and in the 19th century, one Russian ship was allowed in Japan. In the unfair agreement signed with Russia later, Russian Empire was trying to solve the problem with geographical location of Kuril Islands. There was a huge field of coal, and in different periods of time, both Russia and Japan were declaring the Kuril as their ownership. According to an agreement signed in 1855, Russia owned the majority of the Kuril Islands with the hugest fields of the coal. In 1852, the USA government decided to send a flotilla with a leader in face of Matthew Perry to the Japan. Formally, this mission was peaceful, but a lot of evidences are saying that the Matthew Perry was allowed to use the military force. Matthew Perry was supposed to form US predominant political influence in Japan, push aside other countries including England, France and Russia. And he also was supposed to collect all sorts of information about this country and other regions of the Far East, which would facilitate further development of the economy. USA wanted to trade with Far East market. In the July of 1953, military squadron entered Uraga, a bay not far from Erado. Because of a real risk to be attacked, Japanese had to let him in. Matthew Perry gave to Japanese people the conditions of the agreement and said that he will come in 1 year in order to ask for their response. At this moment, Japan couldn't fight against the USA. For example, they had only 30 barrels for 1,000 of people. The situation of lack of wars led to the fact that the military industry in the country wasn't developing at all. In the result, when Matthew Perry came back, he forced the Japanese government to sign an agreement with these conditions. Were open to entry of American ships and supplying them with all the desired ports of Shimura immediately after signing, and Hakodate 1 year later, while not limiting neither the number of the ships nor the volume of the trade, creating the regulating procedure for those who was shipwrecked. Americans were not subject to restrictions imposed on the Dutch and Chinese in Nagasaki. Americans got the right to exchange trading with whatever currency they want. That, in the condition of the financial crisis, reflected the monetary and financial situation in the country. The United States received the status of the largest favorable future. The United States received the status of the largest favorite in the future, and they got any privileges that would win others' country. In case of unfavorable environmental objects, the ships are allowed to enter any Japanese ports. A bit later, similar agreements were signed with Russia, France, and England. While deciding about opening the country, the government decided not to take a decision by itself. They sent letters to many daimyos asking them. Many of them didn't respond, but it showed to the daimyos that Bakufu lost its power. In the 60s, there were a lot of natural disasters, and there was a big hunger and a lot of uprising in small and big cities. In 1867, Tokugawa Yoshinobu became shogun. He was a talented person and he started doing capitalism reforms. But in 1867, Bakufu almost fully lost its power. Samurais were joining in the groups and robbing the warehouses of the government. This is how ended the Tokugawa period that started in 1603 when Tokugawa Ieyasu, the first shogun, won the Battle of Sekigahara. The beginning of this period was characterized by stable economy and stable situation when there were talented shoguns. But later, the contradictions in the feudal system started showing up, and especially the economy of the Japan was weak compared to other countries that were doing the capitalist reforms. And in fact, the Tokugawa period that lasted for more than 2 centuries created the conditions for fast development of capitalism in Japan in the next period in its history, Meiji Restoration.